Thanks very much, Lucy, and I'll add my welcome. So welcome all. We're glad you could participate. This is new research for us, and we always are excited to share new research and get your questions and reactions and your desires for continued research. So for this, just many of you may already know this, but periodically we go out to the MRG community to ask what issues are emerging in your practice, in your work, that MRG can help attend to by gathering data and producing research and hopefully giving some insights that help in the work with all of our clients. So we most recently went out and asked the MRG community these questions in 2018. And as a result of some really good input, we added 4 research questions to the LEA Observer Questionnaire, and we added 3 research questions to the LEA Self-Questionnaire. And so for the LEA Observer Questionnaire, we added questions about perceptions of a leader's resilience, perceptions of how inclusive the leader was, perceptions about how effective the leader is in leading change, and of course, for today's webinar, perceptions about conveyed self-confidence, how self-confident the leader seems to be. We added 3 research questions to the self-questionnaire, and so we asked about a sense of how the degree to which the leader felt they were authentic in their role. We asked about their perception about growth mindset, and of course, we asked a question about their felt self-confidence. So we have reached the stage where we now have enough data to begin to explore these concepts, and so today we're really happy to be sharing our first wave of insights regarding self-confidence. So our agenda for today is we'll be exploring what we've learned in both conveyed and felt self-confidence area. Conveyed being the sense of what observers perceive in the individual, and felt, of course, that internal sense of how self-confident I feel. We're going to look at some demographic differences in self-confidence. We're going to look at generation and gender. As I think many of you know, we do a lot of research in the space of demographic differences, so we wanted to share some early research in that space. And then, of course, we want to look at, is there a shadow side to conveyed self-confidence? Is there risks that we need to be mindful of, and how can we understand those risks when we see leaders with very high self-confidence? So Maria is going to take us away and jump us right into the definition of self-confidence and our research in that space.
Thank you, Tricia. Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So I am going to start by talking a little bit about what we mean by self-confidence and why it's so important. So, so we can establish a little bit of common ground to talk about this. So when you look at the literature on self-confidence, it's defined as a measure of certainty about success, okay? And it can be specific, and that's really useful when you're working on familiar tasks and you're confident that you can succeed at them. It can be general, which is very useful for novel or new tasks. And what self-confidence does is it influences many different things, but it's especially good at influencing how long we persist on a task and how willing we are to try new tasks. This is not a simple phenomenon. This is something that grows out of lifelong experiences and has to do with not just the experiences that we have, but how we interpret those experiences throughout our lives. When we talk about self-confidence, we're going to make the distinction between something that we feel and something that we convey. Okay, so for the purposes of this presentation, we will call them felt self-confidence and conveyed self-confidence. Felt self-confidence is perceived by the individual themselves, and they're able to rate it. It's an internal feeling that they can rate, say, on a scale from 1 to 7. Conveyed self-confidence is something that others see in the individual and is inferred from overt behaviors, right? We can't read other people's minds, but we can see how they are behaving and make an inference about how much self-confidence they have. And we're calling this conveyed self-confidence because it's perceived by others. So why are we here today? we know based on the literature, and we're going to share that with you, that conveyed self-confidence is important. It's important for leadership. Conveyed self-confidence is closely associated with status. Essentially, if you look like you can do it, others assume that you can do it, and if they think that you can do it, then you will be given more opportunities to have control, more power, and opportunities to lead. So when you put all of that together, what you're seeing is that being able to convey self-confidence enhances your chances of success, simply because you have more opportunities to try new things and demonstrate that you're capable of doing them. Interestingly, we looked at what happens when we attribute self-confidence to someone who isn't effective or competent. So we looked into the literature, and it turns out that research shows that nothing really happens when someone who was seen as highly self-confident is seen as not competent or effective. So even after seeing evidence that someone is not effective at a task for which they were seen as highly confident, the high confidence status persists. And along with that unchanged status, so do the benefits. So individuals who step into a situation conveying high confidence will continue to reap the benefits even if they aren't that competent. And so knowing about the robustness of conveyed self-confidence, there really is a need for us to help our clients walk into situations with the right amount of self-confidence, of conveyed self-confidence. This will help them get opportunities they need to continue to grow as leaders, and even perhaps the opportunity to miss one or two things and still be seen as highly competent and potentially successful. Of course, we have our own data, so we don't just rely on the literature. We wanted to look at what our own data had to say about the importance of self-confidence. And what we found is that conveyed self-confidence correlates with many different leadership impact measures. Okay. There's at least a moderately strong correlation with a variety of different leadership impact measures. And if we put these together, what we get is that leaders who are seen as highly self-competent, as highly high on conveyed self-confidence, are also seen as highly skilled business leaders. It tends to correlate with moving forward in business, being able to overcome new obstacles, being able to take control, and being able to make effective choices. So putting all of this together, we know that conveyed self-confidence is important. So what is the next question? The next thing we want to help leaders figure out is how can they grow their ability to convey self-confidence? And what we're going to share today is brand new research aimed at answering this question. How do we help leaders increase their conveyed self-confidence? Our study involves over 4,000 participants from 20 plus countries. Men and women were represented, many industries, job functions, and management levels. So this is a very varied group of leaders from around the world. We used the LEA 360, and the LEA 360 is a multi-rater leadership assessment that has been used in more than 100 countries and has more than 1 million total participants. It is a 360 assessment, so it consists of an observer questionnaire and a self-questionnaire. The observer questionnaire measures 22 leadership behaviors and 31 leadership competencies in the eyes generally of bosses, peers, and direct reports. The self-questionnaire is completed by the leader themselves, and it measures the same 22 leadership behaviors and 3 research items. And as Tricia mentioned before, we use these research items to answer questions like the one we're discussing today. So the research results we will be sharing today involve 2 self-confidence items, one in the self-questionnaire and one in the observer questionnaire. The one that you can see on screen now is the observer item. And it asks observers to rate on a scale from 1 to 7 how much a leader is demonstrating that conveyed self-confidence. The self item is similar to that one, but now it's the leader who's being asked to rate their own level of felt self-confidence. So it's an internal assessment of how self-confident the leader is, and they rate it on a scale from 1 to 7. Okay, so in trying to explore the best way to increase a leader's conveyed self-confidence, we thought that the most direct path would be feeling self-confident would lead to conveying self-confidence. And so the first analysis that we ran was to test whether there was a relationship between felt self-confidence and conveyed self-confidence. So let's run our first audience poll, and I'm going to ask you all to guess. What do you think we found? Did we find a relationship between felt self-confidence and conveyed self-confidence?
Thanks, Maria, and everyone's welcome to vote here, and go ahead and go on gut instinct. Don't think too long. It's a simple yes or no, and we'll reveal the results in just a moment. I'll give folks a chance. Just a couple more seconds.
I definitely think we should come up with poll-taking music.
I agree. I agree. All right, we've got a lot of folks logging in, so let's share those results. So 74% said yes, they believe there's a correlation, and 26% said no.
Thank you, Lucy. So I would like to say that the correct answer is no, but you were not, we were thinking the same thing you were. We were sure we were going to find a connection between felt and conveyed self-confidence. We were really surprised to find this very small correlation between the two. And this is something that we'll continue to explore in other research, but it appears, at least for now, that there is little support for the idea that feeling self-confident would be a good strategy for increasing conveyed self-confidence. It's such an interesting finding. This is why the research is so important. Our intuition doesn't always get us to the correct answer. So we were really surprised by this last result, as I mentioned. So we did a little more digging into felt self-confidence. And what we did was we conducted a relative weights analysis. And this is similar to a traditional regression analysis where you enter predictors and outcome variables. And we wanted to see if there were specific behaviors associated with felt self-confidence. So what we did was we entered felt self-confidence as an outcome variable, and the 22 LEA behaviors as rated by the self were entered as predictors to determine, again, if there was a behavior pattern associated with felt self-confidence. Turns out there wasn't. There was no behavior pattern in the self questionnaire that was associated to higher levels of felt self-confidence. And so what we can conclude at this point is that whether felt self-confidence leads to particular behaviors or particular behaviors lead to feeling self-confident, the patterns appear to be unique to the individual. And this result really speaks to the importance of individual coaching when helping leaders feel self-confident. You really need to get at the root of what makes that leader feel self-confident. Okay, but let's get back to our original question. How do we help leaders convey self-confidence? We know that felt self-confidence is not the way, so what else can we look at? We decided to run a similar analysis. We conducted a relative weights analysis, but now conveyed self-confidence was the outcome variable, and the 22 LEA behaviors as perceived by observers were the predictors. Okay. And I'm going to start by telling you that we did find a relationship here. There is a pattern of behavior that appears to convey self-confidence. But I would like to ask everyone to guess again which of the behaviors listed below has the greatest impact on conveyed self-confidence. Is it being persuasive? Is it taking a strategic approach? Or is it seeking opportunities to take charge? And I'll hand it off to Lucy.
Thanks, Maria. So you should see that poll up on your screens now. We're seeing the votes start to come in. I'll give folks just a few more seconds to weigh in on this before Maria reveals our results. All right. Thanks, everyone. Get those last couple votes in. Okay. So 39% said being persuasive, 22% said taking a strategic approach, and 39%, oh, a tie, said seeking opportunities to take charge.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So very interesting. So we have a tie between A and C, and B is a close third, I guess. So I'm going to tell you that all of these were important for conveyed self-confidence. They all had an impact on conveyed self-confidence, but the one that stood out was C, seeking opportunities to take charge, which is, if you're familiar with the LEA, is what we call management focus. So management focus was more than twice as important for conveying self-confidence as any other behavior set. So not that far off because they were all important. So here are the full set of results. On the left side, you can see all 22 LEA leadership behaviors. The length of each bar indicates the strength of the relationship between a behavior and conveyed self-confidence. And you can see that that bar for management focus is very long. The color of the bar indicates the direction of the relationship. Okay. So darker blue means there's a positive relationship, and the light blue indicates an inverse relationship. So for example, higher levels of management focus are associated with greater conveyed self-confidence, while decreases in deference to authority are associated with greater conveyed self-confidence. So those move in opposite directions. Now let's look at the most important ones, highlight these over here, and these are the behaviors that had the most impact on conveyed self-confidence: management focus, authority, an inverse relationship, strategic, cooperation had an inverse relationship, and then persuasive and technical. 4 themes emerged out of these relationships, and I think it'll help us understand exactly what that highly self-confident leader looks like. Conveyed self-confidence was related to seeking opportunities to be in charge and feeling comfortable in that role, focusing on long-term impact or being strategic, exerting influence and expanding expertise, and being persuasive, and not necessarily prioritizing others' agendas, right? Putting yours on second so that you can prioritize someone else's agenda. Okay, so we've covered a lot so far. What I've done is we put all of the results so far on the slide so that we have some time to pause and review and maybe answer some questions. So I'm going to hand it off to Lucy.
Thanks, Maria. One question that came in that was interesting, is there a correlation between self-confidence and the exaggeration factor?
We did not look at that. That is a great question. Yeah, I don't want to hypothesize, but we will look at that and we'll include the answer in the Q&A that we send out. Thank you for that question.
Thanks. One question, was there a difference when you looked at men and women in the study? Did you split the data?
Oh, yes. We will talk about that next.
Oh, great.
So I like where your mind is going with that question, because it's exactly where we went with the research.
Yes, we'll get to that later. And there's another question here. Oh, any thoughts about how to identify or assess the impact of past presence of confidence and how it reflects on the present conveyed confidence?
So we do have some longitudinal data in the LEA database. That wasn't what we were addressing with this research, but it would be interesting to look at, especially since we know that it is something that develops throughout the lifespan. And it would be interesting to see how, as one goes up in management level and things like that, likely because they're succeeding at different things, if self-confidence would increase, if their ability to convey self-confidence would increase. And that is certainly an interesting question for future research.
Thanks. And a couple clarifying questions actually about authority, and I think they're all related. Could you clarify the term authority, what it means? Because I think that's potentially causing some confusion around that correlation.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. So our measure of authority really refers to deference to authority. And so when you think about it that way, with drops in deference to authority, a person is seen as more self-confident. So they're not relying on authority to make decisions. They're displaying a little bit less deference than the rest of the group.
Got it. I think that will answer a couple of the questions that have come in. One person noted the negative impact of cooperation when we so often encourage collaboration at teamwork. Do you have any comment on that?
So with cooperation, we're not looking at absolute values here. So we're not saying that they're low on cooperation, but when you look at that whole group, when you are more focused on completing your tasks and less likely to defer your time to other tasks, then it's that visual. You convey a little bit more self-confidence, perhaps because you're prioritizing your tasks. Yours are more important. And so it gives that general aura that's probably associated with conveyed self-confidence.
Maria, I might add just a little bit to that. I think it's always challenging in our research when we say less use of a behavior or lower. And so just want to reiterate, as Maria said, we're not talking about absolute values, that we're talking about degree of emphasis in comparison to the comparison population. So in this case, what pattern do we see in leaders who are seen to convey a high level of self-confidence compared to leaders who are seen as conveying less self-confidence? And so I think one of the things we're seeing here is potentially when cooperation is overused. So how can I help you? Always willing to help, always willing to compromise, always willing to put your objectives aside. Over time, and overuse of cooperation can be seen as putting a leader in a more tentative space. So I think lots of times when we see less emphasis, probably what is happening with the more effective population is they're guarding the overuse of those behaviors rather than completely eliminating them from their behavior mix in their approach to leadership.
Thanks, Tricia. One more quick clarifier, and then we should move on to the next section. Can you just define management focus again for folks who may not be familiar?
Tricia, do you want to jump in? And
absolutely. So management focus is measuring the degree to which the leader is seen as being comfortable in the take charge role, the degree to which they're seen as being the one who takes initiative to make sure issues get resolved, problems get resolved, the degree to which they're really comfortable in asserting a level of power and a level of influence. So you can sort of see it as the person who's comfortably seated in the aspects of power associated with a managerial and or leadership role.
Thanks, Tricia. A lot of great questions came in. If we can't get to them within the hour, again, we'll make sure that you get an answer, and we'll answer a lot of them on our blog as well. But I will let us go on, but please continue to add those questions as they come up for you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. So one of the questions that we're frequently asked about is, are there generational differences? We also get asked about gender differences, and today is no exception. That was one of the questions in that Q&A session that we just had. And so, of course, we had to check. We have the data. Why not look at what they show? And so let's start by looking at generational differences. So we looked at 3 different generations: baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. Okay. I want you to take a few seconds to think about these 2 questions. We looked at whether there were generational differences in ratings of conveyed self-confidence and in ratings of felt self-confidence. So our observers rating leaders differently on conveyed self-confidence based on their generation, and our leaders feeling different in their felt self-confidence based on generation. I'll give you a few seconds to guess before I reveal the answer. Okay, and the answer is no. We found no differences in either conveyed nor felt self-confidence. Okay, so leaders across generations were being rated pretty much equally on conveyed self-confidence, and they felt about equal on felt self-confidence. So the next question, we're always looking at behaviors, right? Because the point or the goal of this research was to help leaders increase their conveyed self-confidence. So we looked for differences in the behaviors associated with conveyed self-confidence. So does a different pattern of behavior convey self-confidence in baby boomers versus Gen Xers versus millennials? So think about what you think the answer is before I share. And yes, we did find some differences, and I am going to share those differences with you. As you can see here, these are the behaviors that are associated with conveyed self-confidence according to generation. Okay. There are some similarities with management focus, lower authority, and lower cooperation, which came out in the previous analysis. But then there are also some differences. And I'm going to invite Tricia to join in and give us her perspective in light of some other MRG research.
Thanks, Maria. So there are several interesting things about looking at this generationally. And when we look at it in light of the generational research we look at just in terms of patterns of leadership in general and patterns of leadership effectiveness, we see, particularly with the millennials, some interesting dynamics. So looking at millennials in general, separate from the self-confidence issue, millennials tend to use the behaviors of consensual and empathy more than their other generational counterparts. So you can imagine that when you're starting off in the leadership space, you may be wanting to connect with people a little bit more. When you're younger, you're really sensitive to what's happening in your peer group. You may also be a little bit less confident in your own point of view. And so consensual can be used a lot. What's your opinion about this? What do you think about this? What would you do in this situation? So once again, just as a reminder, when we say a behavior is lower in a particular population, so in this case for millennials, we're saying consensual and empathy are lower than their other millennial counterparts who are seen as lower in conveyed self-confidence. We're not saying that they are not consensual at all, nor are they not empathetic. What we're saying is they're using it less than their less conveyed self-confident peers. And so what you can imagine is they're probably going out to ask for input with consensual, but less than people that are seen at their age as less self-confident. And with empathy, what we can see in the empathetic space, when leaders overuse empathy, what happens is, like, don't actually want to give them that hard feedback because I think it will hurt their feelings, or I really am afraid to make this decision because I'm afraid of what the reaction might be. So we can see in younger leaders this occasional overuse of empathy in a fear-based way. So when millennials are seen as more self-confident, what we're seeing is probably a more appropriate use of consensual and empathy that is more balanced in with the other behaviors. So in this way, they're a little bit atypical. The high perceived self-confident millennials are a little bit atypical in their generation, particularly in those two behavior patterns. I could keep talking, but I won't because we need to go to gender.
Thank you, Tricia. One thing that I would like to share before moving on to gender is that, there are a lot of behaviors here, but there are a few takeaways in general as well. When we're creating a developmental plan to help leaders grow their conveyed self-confidence, it is important to consider generation, right? We can see that there are some differences across generations. But interestingly, because there were no generational differences in the amount of conveyed self-confidence that observers were perceiving, we don't necessarily need to flag people because of their generation. It's more based on the individual and what they need to develop and what they need to focus on. Okay, so let's move on to gender. Some interesting stuff here. Okay, so let's start by looking at whether there are differences in ratings of conveyed self-confidence depending on gender. A few seconds to guess. And here we go. No, no difference between male and female leaders in terms of conveyed self-confidence. So when you look at the numbers, observers were giving them very similar scores on conveyed self-confidence. Now we turn to the next question, felt self-confidence. Is there evidence of gender differences in ratings of felt self-confidence? So do male and female leaders feel different in terms of felt self-confidence? And I'm going to reveal the answer right now. Yes, we did find a difference. And I'm going to let you guess which one it was. And now I'm going to reveal the answer. Men scored a 5.71 on average on felt self-confidence, and women were a little lower with a 5.47. So even though observers did not see a difference between male and female leaders in terms of conveyed self-confidence, there was a difference in terms of felt self-confidence. And of course, you want to look at behaviors. So were there differences in the behaviors associated with conveyed self-confidence? And we did find some differences, and they are listed here. Similar to generations, there are some similarities, and there are some differences. And I will again invite Tricia to join in and share some of her insights.
Thanks, Maria. So again, I'm going to relate these findings to what we know about patterns of leadership based on gender in general. And so what's interesting about this data is that some of the behavior patterns associated with conveyed self-confidence in both men and women seem to come about when members of each gender display slightly non-gender typical behavior patterns. So let me give you a couple of examples. So for men, in general, men tend to use the behavior of restraint, so being more reserved, more calm, having less emotional expression in the way that they engage. They tend to have more of that. They also tend to communicate less. They tend to be less verbal. They tend to give less detail in communication. They tend to share less information. But when we look at male leaders who are seen to be more self-confident, we see a shift in that behavior pattern. So we see the men who are seen as more self-confident a little bit lower than the other men on restraint and higher on communication than the other men. So we see a slight atypical gender pattern with men. We also see an atypical gender pattern with women. So women overall tend to express the behavior of strategic, thinking long-term, thinking big picture, making time for planning longer term, and persuasive, being selling ideas, creating compelling language to change people's minds. We see women exhibit those behaviors overall less than men do. But when we look at women who are seen as more self-confident than their female peers, they actually are presenting more strongly in those behaviors. So they are more strategic and more persuasive than the women who are seen as less confident. So they're reaching a little bit beyond some sort of gender stereotypical patterns, and as a result are being seen as more self-confident. So helpful to understand the typical gender patterns and where highly self-confident leaders may be stretching sort of beyond the bounds of some typical gender patterns, and as a result being seen as more self-confident than their same gender peers.
Okay, thanks, Tricia. Some very interesting insights. So let's put this all together and take a step back and look at what we know about the type of leader who conveys self-confidence. So regardless of gender or generation, we know that there are 4 themes associated with conveying self-confidence. That has to do with seeking opportunities to be in charge and feeling comfortable, being strategic, exerting influence and expanding expertise, and being persuasive and not prioritizing others' agendas. But there are nuances to this picture, right? So we also need to consider gender and generation when we're helping leaders develop their conveyed self-confidence. And we can't list all of them here, but we wanted to share a few examples. So for women, women who act independently and focus on short-range practical strategies convey more self-confidence than women who don't. And for Generation Y leaders, or millennials, who place less emphasis on demonstrating active concern for others or empathy, they tend to convey greater self-confidence. So there are these slight nuances that we need to take into account when we're helping leaders develop those higher levels of conveyed self-confidence. I think we've reached another good point to pause for a bit and maybe answer some questions. So I'm going to pass it on to Lucy.
Thanks, Maria. Yes, so many terrific questions coming in today, a very active and curious group. So again, if we don't have time for your question on the hour, we will get back to you. A couple questions came in about when we were on the generational research, Gen X showed communication and the other generations did not. And some people were curious and surprised by that finding. Could you explain a little bit what communication means in this context?
So communication has to do with clarity of communication. So it's about setting your requirements ahead, right? So not and maintaining a clear line of communication where you let others know where they stand and whether or not they have met the goals that have been laid out for them. And if there's anything else that Tricia would like to add, feel free to jump in.
Well, you know, I mean, this is a total hypothesis, but when we look at the population of leaders right now across organizations, the majority of them are Gen X, right? Our baby boomers are leaving organizational life, and millennials are still coming into the leadership space. And so we're seeing higher levels of leadership being taken by the Gen X folks. And I'm just wondering whether as you get more direct reports, as you become a leader of other leaders, whether that communication variable just rises in importance overall. And so I would have the hypothesis it may have something to do with the span of control that these Gen X folks have, and their need to be even more visible as they take on bigger leadership roles. It's, you know, it's not a research finding, but you know, it's a hypothesis.
But it's a great one, Tricia. I was going to suggest we can always look at this by looking at the management level as a demographic factor. So we have the data. It's a matter of testing it out and seeing what they show.
Thanks. Again, so many terrific questions, and I wish we could do all of them right now because they're fascinating, but to keep us on time, I'll move us to the next section, and if we can get to some of those later in the hour, we will, and if not, you'll hear from us very soon.
Great. Thanks, Lucy. So, of course, we wanted to know, right, is there a shadow side to conveying a high level of self-confidence? You know, essentially, when does self-confidence become potentially arrogance, or at least an at-risk set of behaviors? So what we wanted to do was look at a couple of other competencies that we also measure in the LEA Observer questionnaire. And so our first exploration was, what happens when we look at a population of people who have a high degree of conveyed self-confidence, and we look at that population in terms of how much they're perceived as having a degree of willingness to listen. And so this is all the leaders in this particular part of the study were high conveyed self-confidence leaders. All of them were seen as very self-confident by their observers. The difference between these two populations is we looked at one group who were seen as having a high degree of willingness to listen, right? Willing to connect to others and make sure they're really gathering other people's points of view, versus people who got a low score on this willingness to listen. So the bottom third of willingness to listen. So we're looking at that and wanting to say, is there much of a difference between these two populations? And of course, we found, yes, a high degree of difference between these two folks. So you're looking at the LEA patterns of behavior between these two populations. The blue line are the leaders who are high on both, right? They were high on conveyed self-confidence, and observers also saw them as very high in terms of willingness to listen. And the green again, also seen as high on conveyed self-confidence, but in this case, got low scores on willingness to listen. So we see lots of differences here. We see, if we look just at the folks who are in green, the low willingness to listen people, they're higher on self, so more independent in their way of thinking. They're lower on strategic, less long-term thinking, lower on outgoing, less social, less friendly behavior, lower on restraint, exhibiting less reserve in their emotional expression, lower on communication, less verbal, less clear, less willing to share information, high on feedback, so very blunt and direct and letting people know where they stand, high on all of the achieving results, so sort of very power-oriented, and at the same time, very low on the team playing, low on those behaviors that connect you to other people. So thematically, what we ended up seeing was, not surprising, the high willingness to listen leaders exceeded the low willingness to listen leaders in all but 3 of the 30 leadership impact questions we ask in the observer questionnaire. And the 3 that they weren't higher on were business aptitude, degree of financial understanding, and the extent to which they take initiative. But all the other impact questions, whether they were cognitive, results-oriented, or people-oriented, were all higher in the group that was both high on conveyed self-confidence and high willingness to listen. Overall, they are cognitively engaged, people-focused leaders. Whereas the low willingness to listen, you can see in the pattern that we saw there, they tend to be aggressive, very independent, more isolated in their approach to leadership, extremely blunt in giving feedback, but at the same time, not very good at the front end of communication. And they tend to be very self-oriented and very power-minded leaders. So what is interesting about this particular pattern of the low willingness to listen and high conveyed self-confidence, many of you may be familiar with our derailer research, looking at leadership patterns that put leaders at risk for derailment. And there are 3 patterns that we found put leaders at risk for being for failing in the leadership space. And the number 1 pattern is this very aggressive, independent-minded. So not only are they not effective, but our derailer research would suggest that they're at risk for all-out failure in the leadership space. So we wanted to look at one other companion space with this self-confident group. So we picked looking at high ethical leadership. So while the willingness to listen says, how much space do you make for others, you very high self-confident leader, this one we wanted to say, how attentive are you to making wise, right decisions? And so what we did, again, all highly self-confident leaders as perceived by observers. One group was also seen as demonstrating ethical leadership, and the other group was seen as very low in demonstrating ethical leadership. Once again, we want to look at the differences between these 2 groups. And of course, not surprisingly, we see differences. And in many cases, we see the same differences we saw in the last population, but there are a couple of differences I want to highlight here. This group is seen as being more innovative, so willing to take more risks, willing to change outmoded assumptions, willing to try new ideas. And while we can see oftentimes that can be good, because they are also power-oriented and not and very independent in their thinking, and not thinking as much or engaged as much as people in the team playing, the risk, what happens here is innovative is potentially not ethical and not people-centric. So when we look thematically at what happens with these 2 groups, again, probably not surprising, the high ethical leader, who is also seen as highly self-confident, exceeds the other group in all of the leadership impact competencies that we measure. So every measure that we have in the LEA Observer Questionnaire, these high ethical leaders exceeded the other group. And not surprising, like the high willingness to listen leaders, these leaders care a lot about others. They care a lot about bringing people along with them. They tend to be more disciplined, both in their thinking and in their way of going about the leadership role, and tend to be knowledge seekers in their approach to leadership. The low ethical leadership, well, we can, sort of, I'm sure, talk for days about this. Like the low willingness to listen leaders, these folks are also aggressive, independent, probably extremely blunt, really wanting to take command, really wanting to change people's minds, but tend to be unreserved in emotional expression. And when we see the level of aggressiveness and bluntness, when you add the heat of emotion to that, you can see that there's a risk for crossing the line into abuse. This group also tends to be much less strategic, so much less aware of the consequences of their decisions and actions. So, just not surprising that we would say that conveyed self-confidence is not a panacea. The research backs up what I know many of us experience in our work with some clients, that conveyed self-confidence can add real value in the leadership role, but without some companion practices that both make space for others and practices that ensure ethical decisions, ethical behavior, conveyed self-confidence can also be part of a destructive leadership pattern. So I think we were going to go to questions next. See if we have time maybe for one question, Luce.
Yes, we have time for a question or two. A lot of great ones again coming in. Does the research show a relationship between conveyed self-confidence and overall leadership effectiveness? I wanted to make sure that was clear.
Yes, I think that in the initial research that Maria showed at the beginning, there are overall effectiveness as a leader manager. So many of you will recognize that as one of the leadership impact questions in the observer questionnaire. There is leaders who are seen as higher on conveyed self-confidence are also seen as higher on overall effectiveness as a leader manager. So there is a direct, they're also, by the way, probably not surprising, seen as higher, having more future potential. So those are two of our, for those of you who might not be familiar with the observer questionnaire, we ask many measures about micro effectiveness, but we ask these two overarching questions about effectiveness on future potential and overall effectiveness, and the leaders who are seen as conveying self-confidence are higher on both of those.
Thanks. One more, I think we have time for one more. Going back to our generational research, the feedback score was high for boomers, but lower for the others. Do you have any thoughts on how we coach younger leaders to be better managers?
What a great question. That might be a 2-day seminar. But what it really is interesting, I think we see this reluctance to give feedback. It's a very frequent pattern. We can see two paths of ineffective feedback. One is the absence of the feedback, right? So we see that a lot with people who are have a lot of the team playing, they're empathetic, and it comes almost with a conflict aversion pattern associated with it. So they don't go in for the direct feedback because they shy away from what might be a difficult conversation. We also see the low feedback dynamic happen when people aren't taking time. So of course we know now leaders are feeling overwhelmed, stressed, overworked, and they're not stopping in order to have meaningful conversations. On the flip side, we see poor feedback patterns of people who are too aggressive. So low on communication, not letting people know at the front end what's expected, but letting them know on the back end that they didn't meet those unarticulated expectations. So using feedback almost as a weapon, as too aggressive. And I think there are two different paths there. The low feedback providers, we need to uncover whether it's a reluctance to have a more challenging conversation, that's the root, or just not making the time. And on the flip side is it an erroneous belief that aggression actually leads to better, aggressive leadership actually leads to better performance, which we have plenty of evidence, if you want it, that shows in fact the opposite is true.
Thanks, Tricia, and I'll go ahead and let you all move on. And again, we will get you all answers to these terrific questions, but that's probably all the time we have in the hour, but please continue sending them along so we can make sure to get them answered.
Okay, so thank you for the great questions. There's so much to talk about here. So before we end our webinar today, we wanted to go over some of the main findings in our research into helping leaders develop the ability to convey self-confidence. So remember, this is a question we've been looking at for almost an hour at this point. So how do we help leaders develop their conveyed self-confidence? And even though we know that it varies to some degree by demographics, there are 4 themes that seem to be related to conveyed self-confidence. Certain behavior patterns that appear to have an impact on conveyed self-confidence, and we've talked about them several times throughout the presentation today. But as I just mentioned, there are differences based on demographics. And we looked at gender and we looked at generation. There are many other factors that likely play a part in this. And the more we learn about what actually impacts conveyed self-confidence, the better we'll be at helping leaders develop those higher levels of conveyed self-confidence. But in the context of gender, we saw that for women, for example, it is important to be seen as persuasive, strategic, technically savvy more so than it is for men. Whereas for men, it is more important to be seen as tactical, autonomous, and less consensual, cooperative, and restrained in order to convey those higher levels of conveyed self-confidence. The fact that we didn't find a relationship between felt and conveyed self-confidence really highlights the importance of 360 feedback. If the goal is to help leaders convey self-confidence, we need to understand how they are being seen by their peers, their bosses, their direct reports. And so it is important to take that 360 feedback into account and not just rely on self-scores or self-ratings. Finally, we talked a little bit about the shadow side of high conveyed self-confidence. Self-confidence by itself is not going to lead to effectiveness as a leader. Leaders who want to be as effective as possible also need to consider different skill sets that are going to help them use that conveyed self-confidence to put their best foot forward. Okay, so we have a lot of references and resources to share with you. Everyone who signed up for the webinar today and is attending right now, check your inbox. You will get a recording of the webinar. You will get a copy of the slide deck, questions and answers based on the questions that we've received today, and a research summary that will go into a lot more detail about the types of analyses that we ran in the studies that we shared today. Finally, we have a few upcoming events. We have 2 upcoming webinars. One is on compassionate leadership, and that's in May. And then we have a high potential development webinar in June. We have several certifications for the LEA 360, the IDI, and PD. And we will be presenting at several conferences. So if you attend these conferences, please find us. We're always happy to meet up and talk about our research and our assessments. Okay, so thank you very much for spending this time with us. We hope that you will stay in touch. Please expect to hear from us soon with those items that I mentioned earlier, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or would like more information about our research. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Maria. And one more thing, we also just announced this morning, if you're on the MRG email list, you may have seen this. We have the MRG Summit coming up in Portland, Maine, and we're so looking forward to gathering folks there. So that's hot off the presses, brand new information. You'll start to see it on your social media and in your email, and you'll get lots more information about it. But if you have any questions about that, contact us anytime, clientservices@mrg.com. And the same thing if you're attending those conferences and want to arrange to meet up with us there, we'd love to see you. Reach out to us via email as well. And you will get all these materials sent to you this week. We look forward to answering a lot of these terrific questions. Thank you so much for your participation. And thanks, Maria and Tricia. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.